There are perhaps only a handful of characters throughout history known as well as the Creepy Count, appearing in over 200 films.
Dracula is the most portrayed character in cinema. There have been more Draculas than there's been any other character.
And inspiring generations of would-be vampires.
Give my regards to Frost.
Whether you get into the Blade character, Wesley Snipes, or Robert Pattinson in the Twilight Vampires, they all are measured against that original idea of Dracula.
You'll know that I am called the Count.
He's been a caricature for everything from Sesame Street to kids' breakfast cereals.
It was the new chocolatey marshmallow in my Count Chocula cereal.
I think outside of somebody like a character like Santa Claus, you'd be hard-pressed to see one that's been as commercially and regularly exploited.
In the Middle Ages, all of Europe was ravaged time and again by a real monster. We know it as the bubonic plague. Superstitious Europeans knew it only as an unfathomable terror that left a corpse with a discolored face. They called it the Black Death. Those struck by the plague sometimes lapsed into a coma. Presumed dead, they were often buried alive. Stories spread of corpses clawing their way out of freshly dug graves, breathing new life into the myth of the vampire. Unable to explain the Black Death, much less fight it, villagers blamed the undead.
The things that they interpreted as evidence that the body was a vampire were a change in color, and they thought that if the body had turned darker than it had been in life, then it was a vampire.
By the 15th century, the Black Death had wiped out a fourth of Europe's population. Then the killer vanished as mysteriously as it appeared. In the 15th century, the kingdom of Wallachia in what is now Romania was racked by civil war. The king of Wallachia belonged to the Order of the Dragon, a group sworn to fight the Turks in support of the church. He was called Dracul, the word for both dragon and devil. When Dracul was killed in 1447 by his own nobles, the crown passed to his son, Vlad Tepes, called Dracula, literally the son of the devil. No one guessed the boy would live up to his name. Throughout childhood, Vlad had been held hostage by the Sultan of Turkey to keep his father at bay. Released to take the throne, Vlad swore vengeance on his father's killers. He invited them to a great feast, then locked them in the hall and burned it down. He spent the rest of his life wreaking havoc on his enemies, real and imagined. His favorite form of execution was impaling his victims alive on a long, sharpened stake. The stake was then set in the ground, and the victim left to struggle like a worm on a hook in an agonizingly slow death. So many people were executed this way, guilty and innocent, that Vlad acquired the title, The Impaler. He even had a table set among his dying victims so he could dine amid their agony.
Vlad Tepes was not a vampire. He was a bloodthirsty ruler who killed a lot of people. He was as bloodthirsty a ruler as anyone up until Hitler.
In 1448, Vlad's father was murdered by the power-hungry Wallachian nobility in a plot to take the throne. After 6 long years in exile, Vlad's chance to rule had finally come. The Turks raised their army and put Vlad at the helm. He was to be the Sultan's new prince of Wallachia. But within 3 years, Vlad had turned on the Sultan and had thrown him out of what was now his realm. Barely 25 years old, Prince Vlad Dracula began his infamous and bloody reign.
And the island is said to be littered with countless human bones. Today, the monastery is a place of pilgrimage for Dracula's fans. It is said his body lies in a grave at the altar, but that his head was cut off and sent to the Sultan to prove he was finally dead.
Tradition and wishful thinking places Vlad in this tomb at the monastery of Snagov, but the tomb is empty. There is nothing inside.
Past excavations have found no proof that Vlad's body was buried in Snagov. His last resting place remains a mystery. In Romania today, Vlad Dracula remains a national hero despite his brutality.
And His Royal Highness Prince Charles, who can trace his ancestry back to Romania's dark and distant past.
The genealogy shows that I'm descended from Vlad The Impaler, you see. So I do have a bit of a stake in the country.
As it were.
Dracula is still on the loose, but in a watered-down version. Harmless, at least to others. Modern, self-proclaimed vampires who drink human blood.
I am not a Satanist. I have nothing to do with devil worship. I don't attack and kill people. The people that I take blood from are donors, not victims. These are willing people, consenting adults, never an animal, never a child.
I think vampires speak to some very deep levels of our own feelings and consciousness. That's why they have caught on in ways that other monsters have not. I mean, Frankenstein, werewolf, the mummy are all very popular, but you don't have fan clubs for them. You do have fan clubs for the vampire, for Count Dracula, and for Lestat.
The would-be vampire with a quiet taste for human blood inhabits a tiny world, a cult within a cult. He lives not simply on the fringe of society, but beyond it. But then, so did the vampire.
The vampire represents someone who is outside of society, who in a way is powerless because of his own needs to survive. And so it gives people something to identify with. Someone say, oh, he's just like me.
The vampire is the strangest of creatures, a being who never really lived, and yet who exists throughout time. He has died 1,000 deaths, but returns again and again in the guise of a mass murderer and a serial killer. He is a figure of myth and fact. If vampires are simply living monsters, then they still walk among us.